The sound of sewing machines hummed softly in the background as Miriam Peters sat behind the wooden counter of her large fabric shop at Eden Street Market. Rolls of colorful fabrics lined the walls, shimmering under the dim light of the store. Customers moved in and out, touching the fine materials, bargaining, and leaving with heavy bags filled with luxurious cloth. Miriam was a woman of success. At 42 years old, she had built an empire from nothing, rising to become one of the most respected cloth merchants in the city. But beyond her wealth and business, she had one treasure, one gift she cherished above all else. Her only daughter, Deborah Peters. Deborah had been the child of waiting. For over 10 years, Miriam had begged and prayed for a child. She had visited hospitals, sought the prayers of pastors, and even traveled to distant villages to see herbalists. Nothing worked. People whispered behind her back, calling her the barren woman of Eden Street. But then, one day, after years of pain and unanswered prayers, Deborah was born. A miracle. A child given to her when she had almost lost hope. From that moment, Miriam made a vow. She would give her daughter the best of everything. Deborah would lack nothing. She would wear the finest clothes, eat the best food, and attend the most prestigious school. Miriam would make sure her daughter became great, no matter what it took. The Queen of King's Academy. Deborah didn't just attend any school. She was a student at King's Academy, the most expensive and elite school in the city. It was a place where only the children of the rich and powerful studied. The school had marble floors, air-conditioned classrooms, and the latest technology. And in that school, Deborah was the queen. She was the student everyone admired. Smart, charming, and always dressed in the most elegant uniforms. Every prize-giving day, her name was called over and over again as she won award after award. Teachers adored her. Students wanted to be like her. Parents used her as an example for their children. Look at Deborah, is she not a child like you? Why can't you be like her? Even the teachers at King's Academy treated her differently. Miriam made sure of it. Every term, she visited the school, carrying gifts, expensive perfumes, designer handbags, boxes of fine chocolate. "Thank you for all you do for my Deborah," she would say with a smile, placing the gifts in their hands. And they would smile back, grateful, obligated. But what no one knew was that Miriam's gifts were not ordinary. Each teacher who accepted them unknowingly gave something in return. Their favor, their support, their influence. Everything was spiritually manipulated so that Deborah would always be the best, no matter what. The new term at King's Academy had just begun, and as usual, Deborah walked into the school gates like royalty. She smiled at her classmates, nodding at the teachers who greeted her warmly. Everything was as it should be. Until she entered her classroom and saw the new girl. Her name was Naomi Johnson. She was beautiful, just like Deborah, but that wasn't what made people stare. It was the way she answered questions, the way she solved math problems faster than anyone else. In her first week, Naomi had already impressed every teacher in the school. "She's a genius," the students whispered. "Did you see how fast she solved that problem? Even faster than Mr. Daniels. Maybe she'll be the top student this year." Deborah froze. No one had ever challenged her position before. No one had ever threatened to take her place. But now, everyone was looking at Naomi. And for the first time in her life, Deborah felt something strange. After a few days, Deborah decided to do what she always did when a new student started to shine. She offered a gift. "Hello, Naomi," she said sweetly, handing her a beautifully wrapped box. "This is just a small welcome gift. I want you to feel at home here." Naomi looked at the gift but did not take it. "Oh, thank you, Deborah," she said politely, "but my mom says I shouldn't accept gifts from people I don't know well." Deborah's smile disappeared. No one had ever refused her gift before. Every student at King's Academy knew that taking a gift from Deborah meant being in her favor. It meant getting help from teachers, invitations to exclusive birthday parties, and extra allowances for snacks and school trips. But Naomi didn't seem to care. She just smiled, picked up her books, and walked away. And in that moment, Deborah hated her. That night, Deborah sat in her mother's luxurious living room, her face dark with frustration. "Mama, she refused my gift. Miriam looked up from counting the day's earnings. Her sharp eyes narrowed. Who refused your gift? Naomi. Miriam's fingers froze. Did you smile when you gave it to her? Yes, Mama. I smiled, and I was polite. But she still refused. Miriam's face changed. Her eyes glittered with something cold. She placed a firm hand on Deborah's shoulder. Her voice was calm, steady. You don't need to worry, my dear. Just keep pretending to be friendly. Deborah nodded. She knew what her mother meant. Miriam's gifts to Deborah's classmates and teachers were not just gifts. They were tools. Each one carried a hidden cost, a spiritual exchange. Whoever accepted them unknowingly traded something. Their intelligence, their favor, their future. Miriam had been doing it for years, using the stolen destinies to expand her business and make sure Deborah remained the brightest student in school. But Naomi had refused. She had broken the chain. And that meant she had to be dealt with. Miriam leaned closer and whispered, "What's this girl's full name?" Naomi Johnson. Miriam smiled. Good. That's all I need. You can go to sleep. That night, as the clock struck midnight, and the world outside was silent, Miriam whispered strange words under her breath. A shadowy mist filled her bedroom. And in that mist, she saw Naomi, sleeping peacefully in her bed. Miriam's eyes began to glow. Let's see how smart you are now. She raised her hand and murmured a spell. At that very moment, miles away in Naomi's bedroom, her body suddenly shivered. She tossed and turned in her sleep. Somewhere in her dreams, she heard a strange, low whisper. And then, everything went dark. The next few days at King's Academy felt like a strange blur to Naomi. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but she didn't understand what was happening to her. The sharp clarity she once had in class was slipping away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of fatigue and confusion. Every time she tried to focus on her notes, her hand trembled. Her mind, usually sharp and quick, now felt clouded, as if she couldn't quite grasp the information. She watched in disbelief as her classmates completed assignments with ease while she struggled to make sense of simple math problems. The pencil felt heavy in her hand, and even when she tried to take notes, her fingers seemed to lose their strength. Naomi's once perfect handwriting now looked shaky, barely legible. Her teachers, who had once praised her, now looked at her with mild concern, unaware of the spiritual forces at play. At night, Naomi's dreams grew more disturbing. Each time she closed her eyes, she found herself in a dark, shadowy room. The air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight. She couldn't see the faces of the children sitting around her, but she could feel their vacant stares. Their bodies were stiff, their expressions blank. A shadowy figure approached, holding out a bowl. Naomi wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt frozen, as though something was holding her down. Her hand moved against her will, reaching out to take the food. The moment it touched her lips, a fog seemed to cloud her mind. Everything became heavy and blurry. Each time she woke, her body ached as if she had been running all night. Her muscles were sore, and her head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. It was as if she had been fighting against an unseen force, yet she didn't know what was happening. Naomi tried to tell her mother, Esther, but she was always too busy. It wasn't long before Naomi's behavior started to draw the attention of her teachers and classmates during class. She found herself unable to answer questions. When the teacher called on her, her mind would go blank. The equations that she had once solved in seconds now seemed impossible. Her teacher, Mrs. Grace, grew concerned as she watched Naomi struggle. The bright, confident girl she had praised at the beginning of the term was no longer the same. Naomi's classmates whispered in the corners of the classroom, watching her with confusion and curiosity. "Have you noticed Naomi?" one student said. "She used to be so quick, and now she can't even hold a pen." "She's just lazy now," another student whispered, but Naomi could tell it wasn't true. She wasn't lazy. She just couldn't explain what was happening to her. Mrs. Grace decided to confront Naomi after class. She pulled Naomi aside, her face lined with concern. "Naomi, what's going on? You've been struggling in class, and I know this isn't like you. Is something wrong?" Naomi tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't explain what was happening. She didn't even know how to describe it. I don't know, Naomi said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been trying, but everything feels wrong. At home, things didn't get any better. Naomi's sleep became more restless, and the dreams grew darker. She woke up feeling more exhausted than ever, her body trembling from the nightmares. Esther, Naomi's mother, continued with her busy schedule, unaware of the gravity of what was happening to her daughter. Every time Naomi tried to talk to her about the dreams or the way she was feeling, Esther brushed it off. It's just stress, Naomi. You need to focus on school. You're just tired, that's all. But Naomi knew it wasn't just tiredness. She could feel it. Something dark was pulling her down. Meanwhile, Deborah's life seemed to be back on track. Naomi's struggles had only served to elevate Deborah's status at school. She regained her place as the top student, winning praise from her teachers once again. Naomi's absence from the top of the class made it easy for Deborah to slip back into her role as the shining star. But Naomi's struggle was far from over. As she faced each day, the spiritual forces working against her became more apparent. She couldn't even concentrate during tests anymore. Her pen shook as she wrote, and when she looked at her paper, she could hardly make sense of the questions. It became a daily routine. As Naomi drifted into sleep, she will find her eating from a bowl placed in her trembling hands. Eat, and be free, a voice whispered. No, this wasn't freedom. This was darkness. She fought against the invisible force pulling her hand toward the bowl to eat more, but it was useless. Her hand moved on its own, forcing her to take a bite again and again. The next morning, she woke up feeling more broken than ever. Her mind felt clouded, as if she had no control over her own thoughts. Her body ached, and her hands trembled as she tried to get ready for school. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it, but what was it? Why couldn't she fight it? At school, her classmates began to whisper. Naomi's decline was too apparent now. Her grades were slipping, and she couldn't even hold a pen without it shaking. The Naomi everyone had once admired was no longer there. Instead, she was replaced by a broken version of herself. As Naomi's struggles worsened, the whispers at school grew louder. Her classmates, once in awe of her intelligence, now stared at her with pity. Some avoided her, afraid that whatever was happening to her might spread. Others whispered behind her back, wondering if she was just pretending to be sick or if she was genuinely failing. The brilliant Naomi was now the shadow of her former self. Naomi sat in class, staring blankly at the board as her teacher explained a new topic. Her mind refused to work. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't focus. The words on the board swam before her eyes, and her hands trembled as she tried to write down the notes. Her once perfect handwriting now looked like a child's scrawl, barely legible. Mrs. Grace's concern grew more. She had always known Naomi as a bright, diligent student, but now Naomi seemed almost lost. The teacher sighed as she watched Naomi, whose head was resting on the desk. After class, Mrs. Grace decided it was time to speak to Naomi directly. She couldn't ignore the signs anymore. She pulled Naomi aside, her eyes filled with worry. Naomi, I need to talk to you, Mrs. Grace said gently, guiding Naomi to a quiet corner of the classroom. Naomi tried to muster a smile, but it faded quickly, and she lowered her gaze to the floor. What's happening, Naomi? You're not yourself lately. You've been so tired, and your work has deteriorated. I know something is wrong. You don't have to pretend with me. Mrs. Grace's voice was filled with genuine concern. Naomi looked up at her teacher. She wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to tell her about the strange dreams, the fog that clouded her mind, the weakness that overwhelmed her every morning, but she couldn't. I don't know what's happening, Naomi whispered, her voice shaking. It's like I can't think clearly anymore. I feel lost. Mrs. Grace frowned. Naomi, you don't need to carry this burden alone. If there's something going on, we need to address it. But you must talk to someone. Your mom, perhaps, or a counselor. Something is happening, and I can't watch you go through this by yourself. Naomi nodded, though she wasn't sure what to do next. She didn't know how to explain it, not even to her mother, who seemed too busy to notice the changes in her daughter. But Mrs. Grace's words stuck with her. She knew she had to do something before things got worse. That night, Naomi lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. But it wasn't the night that was making her uneasy, it was the darkness inside her mind. The spell, whatever it was, seemed to have a firm grip on her. She could feel it, pressing on her, clouding her thoughts, stealing her energy. She had been weak, but now she felt like she was fading. Her mother, Esther, was busy with work, as always. Naomi hadn't had the courage to talk to her yet, fearing her dismissal. After all, her mother was always so focused on her career that Naomi felt like an afterthought. She didn't want to be a burden. But tonight, something felt different. As she lay there, drifting between sleep and consciousness, Naomi felt a strange presence in the room. The air was heavy with a pressure she couldn't explain. She tried to scream, to wake herself from the nightmare, but her body wouldn't obey. She felt trapped in a nightmare that wasn't just in her sleep, it was in her life. The force that had been draining her was no longer hiding. Naomi's thoughts scattered, and she realized that she couldn't fight this alone. She had to tell someone. But who? Her mother. Would she even believe her? Naomi's chest tightened with a sense of hopelessness. The next day, after Naomi had dragged herself through another miserable day at school, she decided to speak to someone who might understand. Mrs. Abigail, the woman who had prayed for her mother when they first moved to the city. Naomi found Mrs. Abigail sitting outside the school gates, talking to another parent. Naomi hesitated but then walked over, her feet heavy with uncertainty. "Mrs. Abigail," Naomi said softly. Mrs. Abigail looked up and smiled warmly, sensing Naomi's discomfort. "Naomi, my dear, how are you?" Mrs. Abigail asked, her voice gentle and full of care. Naomi could tell she was a kind woman, someone who understood the importance of faith. Naomi sat down beside her, her voice trembling. I don't know what's happening to me. Everything feels so wrong. Can't think straight. I feel like something is draining me. I've had these strange dreams, and I feel like I'm being pulled down by something I can't see." Mrs. Abigail's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. She placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "Naomi, what you are describing isn't just stress or exhaustion. You are under attack. There are spiritual forces at play here, dark forces that are trying to steal your light." Naomi looked at Mrs. Abigail, her heart pounding in her chest. Could it be true? Was this really happening to her? "We need to pray," Mrs. Abigail said, her voice calm yet filled with authority. "You cannot fight this alone. God's protection is stronger than any darkness, but you must seek Him. Let me pray for you, Naomi." Naomi nodded, feeling the weight of relief wash over her. Maybe she wasn't alone after all. Maybe there was hope. Later that night, after returning home, Naomi went to her room and closed the door behind her. She knelt beside her bed, remembering Mrs. Abigail's words. She couldn't fight this alone. She needed to pray. She needed God's help. "Lord, I am scared," Naomi whispered into the silence of her room. "I don't know what's happening to me, but I need you. Please, help me fight whatever is attacking me. Give me the strength to stand against this darkness." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. Naomi didn't know if her prayer would be answered immediately, but she felt a glimmer of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. As she finished praying, Naomi rose to her feet, her resolve growing stronger. She would fight. And with God's help, she would reclaim what had been taken from her. Her heart had begun to feel lighter after her conversation with Mrs. Abigail. The darkness that had clouded her life for so long had seemed to retreat, even if only slightly. Her prayer that night, though whispered in fear, had been a step forward, a sign of strength. For the first time in weeks, Naomi felt the faintest spark of hope flicker inside her. But deep down, she knew that the battle wasn't over. The strange occurrences, the nightmares, and the dark forces still lingered, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. She couldn't rest yet. Naomi knew she had to take action. She had to fight, not with her own strength, but with God's help. At home, things weren't any better. Her mother, Esther, remained as busy as always, too preoccupied with her business and social obligations to notice her daughter's pain. Naomi had tried to tell her mother about the strange dreams, the overwhelming fatigue, but Esther brushed her off. "You're just tired, Naomi. You need to focus more on your studies," Esther said, waving away Naomi's concerns. "Stop worrying so much." She wanted to cry, but she didn't. Her mother couldn't understand. Naomi realized that no one truly saw the darkness she was fighting. No one but her. In the weeks that followed, Naomi kept her fears hidden, only confiding in Mrs. Abigail. The kind woman continued to pray for Naomi, her belief in God's power unwavering. Mrs. Abigail was a woman of faith, and she knew that Naomi needed a breakthrough. The spiritual forces attacking Naomi were not only trying to steal her intelligence but her very future. One evening, Mrs. Abigail invited Naomi to her home for a prayer session. Naomi hesitated at first, but something inside her told her to go. She needed to trust someone. She needed help. As she walked into Mrs. Abigail's living room, the warm atmosphere seemed to fill her with peace. The room was softly lit, and the faint scent of incense lingered in the air. Mrs. Abigail greeted Naomi with a gentle smile and ushered her to a chair. She sat down beside her and placed a comforting hand on Naomi's shoulder. "Naomi, my dear, the Lord has shown me that there is something attacking you. But tonight, we will break that attack. You are not alone in this fight." Naomi's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Mrs. Abigail, her heart heavy with emotion. Feeling like someone understood her pain, Mrs. Abigail took Naomi's hands and began to pray softly, her voice filled with authority and compassion. The words she spoke were like balm to Naomi's wounded soul, each prayer piercing through the darkness surrounding her. Naomi closed her eyes, allowing the warmth of the prayer to fill her spirit. "In the name of Jesus, I break every chain that binds you, Naomi. Every evil force that has stolen your peace, your clarity, your strength, be gone in Jesus' name." As Mrs. Abigail prayed, Naomi felt something shift inside her. It was as though the very air around her had changed, becoming lighter and freer. She felt the darkness lifting, piece by piece, until it was no longer suffocating her. Naomi felt a peace she hadn't known in months. But the relief didn't last long. That night, Naomi went to bed, exhausted yet hopeful. For the first time in days, she drifted into a peaceful sleep, believing that the battle was finally over. But in the middle of the night, the darkness returned. This time, the presence in her room was stronger, more oppressive than before. The cold air filled her lungs as Naomi woke to find herself in the same dark room from her nightmares. The children were still sitting around her, their hollow eyes watching her every move. The shadowy figure stepped forward, its form more menacing than ever before. Naomi's heart raced. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. "You cannot run," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "You belong to us now." The shadow raised its hand, and Naomi's body froze. She couldn't move, couldn't fight back. She felt as though she were being pulled into an abyss, into a place where light had no power. But just as Naomi thought all hope was lost, a light so bright and so pure filled the room that the shadows recoiled in terror. Naomi's eyes widened as she saw Mrs. Abigail's face glowing with the strength of God's power. Mrs. Abigail's voice rang out, filled with authority. "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus. You have no power over her. Naomi belongs to the Lord, and you will not steal her destiny." The light grew stronger and stronger, and the darkness began to shrink away, like a shadow fading under the sun's rays. Naomi could feel the oppressive weight lifting from her chest, the terror subsiding. Finally, with a deafening crash, the darkness vanished. The cold air melted away, and Naomi was left standing in her room, breathing deeply, her body and soul finally at peace. The next morning, Naomi woke with a new sense of clarity. The fog in her mind had cleared. She felt stronger, more focused, and filled with an energy she hadn't felt in weeks. The spiritual attack had ended. Naomi had been set free. When she walked into school that day, something was different. Her mind felt sharp, her body energized. She sat down in class and, for the first time in days, she understood everything. Her confidence returned, and she began to feel like herself again. In the following weeks, Naomi's grades soared, and she regained her position as one of the top students at King's Academy. No one could explain her sudden turnaround, but Naomi knew the truth. At home, Esther began to notice the change in Naomi. Her daughter, who had been so withdrawn and exhausted, was now vibrant and full of life. Naomi smiled more, spoke more, and even began to excel in her studies once again. But Esther still didn't understand. She had no idea what had truly happened to Naomi. She didn't know about the dark forces Naomi had battled or the spiritual intervention that had set her free. She only knew that her daughter was back, and that was enough for her. Naomi, however, understood the depth of the battle she had fought. She knew that she was stronger now, not just because of her intelligence or her ability to study, but because of the spiritual strength she had gained through faith and prayer.